You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined again by Jeremy Levine, Assistant Professor of Organizational Studies and Sociology at the University of Michigan. In part 2 of our conversation, Jeremy talks more about his book, Constructing Community, Urban Governance, Development, and Inequality in Boston. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note with a cool stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. Still working on some new designs for scarves and some other cool merch, and looking forward to sharing those with you all soon when they're finished. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. And now for part 2 of our conversation, we pick up where we left off last week. In the book specifically, you talk about how there's winners and losers and the kind of dynamic where some neighborhoods that really didn't need help probably got some help because they were on the corridor, and other neighborhoods that needed help did because they were on the corridor. You discuss the need to realize that winners and losers are chosen in order to get better outcomes. But I'm wondering why these philanthropies specifically have that power. How are they given that power to choose winners and losers? And is that even important in the long run?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is one of those things where you got to see the whole field and see sort of how the whole thing is really all connected. You know, to quote a great line from one of the greatest TV shows of all time, all the pieces matter. Lester Freeman from The Wire. But in this case, seeing the whole entire field is really critical, because it's not just that like one organization came in, or one group or one class of organizations like philanthropy came in and said, we're going to do this. And then everyone else said, okay, we're going to let you do it. But you have to sort of understand the entire system of incentives. So to get even understand that, we have to sort of understand that the whole thing is based on this idea that the community matters, the community should be valued, and the community should control development in their neighborhoods. Whether or not that's realized, whether or not that actually happens in practice is sort of an open question, and it's a sort of contentious question. But I think it's undeniable that it's certainly a norm amongst anyone working in this space. But what does that mean then in practice? Largely, it means deferring to local organizations, particularly when we're talking about community development. We're talking about community development corporations in poor neighborhoods, which was the case in Boston. Now, that means that they're being ceded a lot of authority, control, and power from city government, state government, and federal government. Federal government loved the HUD, DOT, and EPA Region 1 administrators, loved the nonprofits, thought they were the epitome of community. They bought into any performance of community that the nonprofits portrayed themselves. They were uninterested in sort of checking them or seeing if that was sort of not true. They were the instantiation of community. And additionally, we have a situation today, which is very different than, say, 60 years ago, when nonprofits are direct recipients of government funding to do community development work. We rely on them to be the ones to do the LIHTC housing, to do the Section 8 housing, particularly in these poor neighborhoods. Like, we have to have them to do the work. Sometimes, yes, it's a joint venture. They work with others, but they're going to be at the table if they exist in a particular neighborhood. Okay, so we've ceded to them, but what does that mean about philanthropy? How does philanthropy play into this? Well, nonprofit community development corporations or community-based organizations in general aren't just getting their money from the government. That wouldn't be enough. They're also getting a big portion of it, in non-trivial amounts, from philanthropy, from foundations, from other sorts of funders, from intermediaries like LISC, like Enterprise, and so on, that sort of sit in between this sort of space of foundations, of federal government grants, where you package them out to local CDCs and other community organizations. So when we are relying on community-based organizations or CDCs to play a big part in doing the work on the ground, or even at a minimum to be the ones that are representing community members at the table, by definition, we're going to bring in their funders as well, right? Their philanthropic funders become a part of this. But in addition to that, philanthropy is also playing a role, and this isn't just Boston, but in general, of shoring up the absence of public resources. Famously, at least in the national media, Mark Zuckerberg put a huge amount of money to Newark public schools, although controversially, it was later revealed that it all went to basically consultants that came up with plans for how to fix Newark public schools and not actual sort of books or facilities or anything like that. But in any event, Newark public schools needed money. Mark Zuckerberg, through his philanthropic giving, gave them the money to help do that. The same thing was true for, frankly, what a lot of stuff that happened in the Fairmount corridor. In the case of the Boston Foundation specifically, they basically were responsible not just for putting together, but also for funding the big Fairmount Indigo Planning Initiative, which at least at the time was the most expensive planning initiative that the city of Boston, what was then called the Boston Redevelopment Authority, had ever engaged in. This was something that the Boston Foundation orchestrated. They put it together. They funded a substantial amount themselves. They actually got other funders to come in and pony up some money at the table as well. They literally had meetings to negotiate between city officials and their own grantees to make sure that everyone was going to be able to work together, to be sort of copacetic, to be friendly, to, not be adversarial on this project. And so to go back to the actual question, how is philanthropy playing a role here? What's allowing them to sort of come into this space? It's partly because we've organized things in such a way that we need the nonprofit sector, both CDCs and their funders, to do the work and to fund some of the work. Also, it's because these organizations have situated themselves as the sort of outside strategic political actor to bring people together. The Boston Foundation was probably one of the best at this during my field work, quite literally doing tours of the corridor for different officials. Geeta herself initially got the EPA interested in the Fairmount corridor by talking to some folks that she had done a different project with and bringing them through, paying for a tour, renting a charter bus, and then having lunch at the Boston Foundation afterwards. Same thing preceded the Fairmount Indigo Planning Initiative. And in fact, the regional administrator from HUD at the time said at one of those things, like, this is what the Boston Foundation brings to the table. This is why we have them. We are sort of doing our thing at HUD, trying to make sense of what we can. You all that are doing work on the ground are trying to make sense of you. We see a value in the Boston Foundation in doing things like this so that we know what's going on and we can all get together and make sure the ship is sort of, or the train in this case, is going in the same direction.
It's just so fascinating how that basically stands in for money that probably in the 50s, 60s, maybe earlier was government money or was
exactly
public funding.
Precisely.
And so that's kind of the change. And, the big thing I think about when I see that is it fair? Is it something that is a positive outcome? And I'm not saying that they don't have the best interests of the community or what they feel like is the best interest of the community in heart. It's just, is it right to supersede elected officials or other agency that people in the neighborhood might have? There's another interesting story about basically they were talking about, I think it was the Mattapan station, where there was this kind of back and forth between whether they wanted the station or not. And the, folks that maybe lived next door were against it because they felt like their foundations would be damaged. But there was an organizing to get more people that were more the community to kind of push back on that. And so I feel like that feeds into that too, which is like, we're talking about NIMBYism in this country. We're talking about housing. We're talking about all these things, but it's ultimately, there is no community that actually exists.
Right.
It's factions, and how the community foundations help build these factions is really fascinating.
Yeah, totally. That's really interesting. And I think this is really the tension and the challenge that was both the hardest part to grapple with in the book, the most interesting part to grapple with, because it's sort of unclear. It's not as sort of straightforward as, a big question of, well, will this be affordable housing? Or will this be luxury housing? Will it be truly affordable housing? Or will it be something in between, which sort of animates a lot of the discussion, especially in the housing space, in the NIMBY, YIMBY, and all that sort of world. And I think that that's important. And I think it is obviously happening. It's not to deny that it's happening, but it sucks up a lot of the public attention because it shows pretty clear sides, and then we can sort of latch ourselves onto them. Do I think affordable housing should be built in this affluent neighborhood? Yes or no? It's pretty clear, or can be pretty clear, where you stand. When we get to the more mundane stuff that I've followed and studied in the book, that I think is frankly the more modal experience of doing community development and seeing these sort of factions, it's way more complicated to have that same sort of normative interpretation. So the example that you provided with this Mattapan station, I think is a really good one. So there is a new station that got built in Mattapan behind Woodhaven Street. Woodhaven Street is a street where there are a bunch of single family homes, and they're mostly the residents are homeowners who are by and large older middle class Black women. Those older middle class Black women opposed that new transit station. They had no problem with the train, no problem with the tracks, but having a new station built, they were worried about a lot of things, privacy, but mostly it's like it was construction. They thought the rattling was going to literally rattle their foundations. Their homes were going to be worth nothing anymore. And so that was their stated claim. So there used to be, and there was at one point, a community development corporation in Mattapan, but about halfway through my field work, it went bankrupt. Basically, there was not enough money coming in for the money that needed to be coming out. The executive director at the time, a guy named Spencer DeShields, he went on vacation and then he basically just never returned. There was an interim director for a little bit, but basically they went kaput. Funders saw them as a risky bet. They said, we don't want to put more money into this if it's not going to show a successful project. So, we're not going to sort of save it. Okay. So you have a bunch of residents then, community members, undeniably, that don't want this new train station. And then add the sort of race and class dynamics, which are complicated in this case, Black middle-class women. So they're really the only people saying one way or another what they want in this neighborhood. And what they want is to not have a new transit station. Now, this neighborhood is one that is pretty far off from the closest other rapid rail. From there to get to, say, downtown, it means like a bus to a train, and it cuts everything by like a third. So the members of the nonprofit coalition around this corridor that used to include that CDC in Mattapan that went bankrupt, they wanted the new station because it was part of their broader plan for this corridor that had all this money behind it, that had the HUD, EPA, and DOT advocating for it and so on. So they basically were trying to create community support for it and organize. They got a foundation to give them money twice, 2 different rounds. That foundation ultimately decided not to re-up with them later, I learned, after my fieldwork had ended, sort of didn't think it was going to a good place. But they got money to basically hire some people to be the directors of organizing, to gin up support to oppose those community members. Okay, so if we step back though and think about this, like this is really complicated to make sense of, to sort of say, as particularly from a NIMBY-YIMBY perspective, right? So on the one hand, we have like Black community members that are saying something that we have to take seriously. Like they don't want it, they're community members. If there is such a thing as community control, if there's such a thing as valuing the community, as they said, their voices should be heard. At the same time, we then have an outsiders to the community organizing with philanthropic dollars to essentially suppress the one big community voice that's coming. And then at the same time, on top of all of that, what are we talking about though? A resource, public transit access that would benefit the poor Mattapan residents that don't have cars, unlike those middle-class residents that drive to the meetings that they went to on Woodhaven Street in Mattapan. So I think when you get down to these sort of actual cases that aren't something that just sort of elevates up to something that would make it clear and obvious, say, New York Times article or whatever about the NIMBY-YIMBY world, it's very hard to say, to your original question of like, is this good or bad? It's kind of complicated, right? And I think getting down to it, it really challenges us to wrestle with this, is it good or bad? And I honestly don't know where I stand on it, to be frank with you. And it was actually a challenge. And I think readers of the book may find some of it unsatisfying, my take on it, because, I see this as something that is like a problem to have outsiders undermining the community. But also we're talking about a resource that is benefiting an aspect of the community that wasn't represented from those middle-class folks. And I think really at a minimum, the book is organized around trying to make some of those tensions way more explicit than at least I've seen them either in the press, in the popular conversation, or even in scholarship for that matter. If we're going to make sense of all this, we got to put all those tensions all on the table.
There's another piece that relates to that, I think, that goes to capacity and capacity building. And that's a term that I heard so many times when I was at my previous job. But you say that it kind of has its own bias. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. So the problem with capacity Capacity is a thing that makes a lot of sense. So when we are thinking about funders that are deciding between a lot of different grantees with limited resources, who to give money to, and that includes both public resources and private philanthropic resources. The value, and for reasonable reasons, is on those that have potential grantees that have the capacity to do a project. In some ways, like, it makes total sense, right? Why would you fund someone that doesn't have the capacity to do projects? The catch-22 here, though, is that how does one develop capacity in the first place? And this is where there's a big hole in resources that are available, particularly for groups on the ground that are trying to do this work. In the case of Mattapan, for nonprofits that are maybe trying to start up to get things going, where do you even begin? And it's a challenge because both philanthropic dollars and public dollars are not incentivized to fund capacity. They're not incentivized to write a check, a sort of like, when Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Bezos announced their split, there's a huge windfall for Mackenzie Bezos. And very famously, she wrote checks, no questions asked, to grantees. Hugely popular, a bunch of HBCUs and others, and actually people that are unclear weren't even expecting it. She just was sort of giving it all out. That is not the norm in grant giving in the public or philanthropic space at
Definitely
all.
not.
No. Instead, it's sort of like, let's sort of see who has the capacity. So because these groups are incentivized to show success with their grants, right? Particularly when we think about foundations, these are strategic private organizations. They want to think about the work that they're doing. They want to think that they're not just like writing checks to people. They don't want to think they're just sort of giving it out. They want to think that they're doing it with intention. The fact that like their grants are going to make an impact, are going to have an effect, are going to make lives better for people, rightfully so. You can't know that you're going to make people's lives better if you fund an organization or a place that you have no idea if the program will be successful at all, or if there ever even will be a program. You could dump millions and millions of dollars into trying to get an organization on its feet, to try to get it with the staff that can sort of do a project, to do the organizing that's necessary. It may take millions and millions and millions of dollars to even get close to that over many years. Funders aren't incentivized to make that happen. So it means then that when they're determining who gets money and who doesn't, they're going to privilege capacity, who has the capacity. That means then if you sort of don't have the capacity, it's like impossible to get your feet off the ground, right? It's this catch-22. You can't do the projects because you don't have the money, and you don't have the money because you can't do the projects that show you have the capacity to do more projects. And so in the end, then it creates a system that, again, it gets a little tricky when we think about, is this good or bad? On the one hand, I think it's great that organizations in disadvantaged neighborhoods like Upham's Corner and Codman Square, they had great high capacity organizations with 5 to 10 at the time $1 million annual budgets that were doing really good work, building housing, building affordable housing. Great. The problem, though, is that what does that mean about Mattapan and about getting stuff done in Mattapan? So it's one of these things where the capacity point has a lot of sort of obvious and reasonable reasons to focus on it. But if we're going to do that, then we got to be clear that some organizations, some neighborhoods as a result, when organizations become the proxy for their neighborhoods, are going to be left behind, and are more importantly going to be left further behind, right? It's a relative inequality thing. It's not about like, is this money helping sort of change the dynamics between poor neighborhoods and non-poor neighborhoods, but rather some poor neighborhoods are able to sort of keep going, maybe sort of, get stuff a little bit better than it once was. But others are just never going to be able to catch up. And that's the problem with the sort of way funding is done now, the emphasis on programs, privileging capacity when determining who's going to get funding, and the sort of reticence, frankly, to even give capacity grants, to sort of write a check to someone to say, do your thing.
Can you make a comparison to the gatekeeping that seems to exist in this way to the gatekeeping of, say, zoning codes? It just popped in my head, so it's not like a preconceived question I had. It feels like there's a gatekeeping in trying to get into community development, and there's kind of these cliques and groups that operate it. And you mentioned, if you don't have the capacity, it's the double-edged sword. But it feels like the same way kind of with zoning codes and letting people into a neighborhood, letting people into the system. It seems like on both sides, generating a problem and creating an inequality in some form or fashion.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about barriers to entry, really, of getting involved, of getting access to resources, and of having these resources distributed more equitably. I'd say the sort of key difference then would be the difference between sort of codifying into law, what can and cannot happen, whereas this system is dealing and affected by different laws and different sort of regulations, but a lot of it is a sort of like social norm almost of working together. It's driven by the fact of like all these different groups and their incentives to work together and what kinds of projects they're incentivized to work on and not. It's certainly driven by what kinds of funding are available.
The other thing is just, you mentioned also the professional kind of ism of community development corporations. And it makes me wonder also, if you're just somebody in the community that wants to make a difference and come into the system, you're excluded. But a lot of the folks that work on these foundations and the community development corporations and others are their professional class. They were trained in school for this, or they came up through the ranks because they were hired at a young age into the system. And so that differentiates them from community members who just live in the community and probably don't have the same amount of time because it's not their job.
Yeah, totally. With one important caveat. So the totally part is that this field is so diffuse. I mean, I tried to do this network map at one point in the book to sort of show how many different players are involved. And I didn't even really do it justice for that matter. But it's just this blob of different groups and organizations. And you imagine if you're someone that just sort of shows up to the meeting, you could show up to one meeting one week, another one another week. It's all ostensibly about, say, a particular project in your neighborhood. But like maybe you have an acronym of DND leading the meeting. Next week, the acronym is BRA. Next week, it's DOT or whatever, all these acronyms. And I'm just using the government acronyms. Maybe it's co-hosted by an organization called CSNDC. There's all these different groups and they all know who's what and what's what, right? Themselves, the field, right? And even then there was some confusion. Sometimes they didn't quite know. It actually made it, my value add in some ways was sort of trying to map out all these different players. But the average person coming off the street doesn't know that. And the problem then is that you go thinking that like, oh yeah, well, we heard this last week from you, the city, right? But actually the city can mean like 7 different agencies that are all involved in different aspects of a particular project that are co-sponsored with a bunch of nonprofits that maybe have some philanthropy there too, that might be at the meeting or whatever, wherever the funding's coming from. And so that level of just even understanding who the players are, I think is a significant barrier to entry. What the caveat is though, is that some of those sort of professional class stuff wasn't as consequential as I had really thought it was. Now, yes, it is inconsequential as a barrier to the sort of social or cultural capital access of someone that doesn't necessarily have those degrees. But the degrees, for instance, and in Boston, the big degrees are like MIT, from DUSP, from urban planning. Like those are some of the main players that would be involved in this. I was surprised about at times where that may have been a barrier to like access to the field, but once there, that wasn't necessarily like your ticket to getting involved and getting a seat at the table. Routinely, people could be denigrated for, in fact, having an MIT or Harvard degree as being sort of not really attuned to what was happening. And that sort of cultural capital and talking that talk could at times be a liability within, conditional on those that are there sort of already. So it's one of those things where like the clean and neat story, right, of like the professionals that all like are at the same country clubs and like go to the same events and sort of have all that sort of same degrees, or maybe we're in the same graduate classes together, that wasn't actually necessarily like the end all be all. And in fact, some people that literally were in the same master in city planning graduating classes from MIT could find themselves on opposite ends of particular issues around projects. And that alone was not sufficient. For instance, there was a particular case actually where someone was trying to get resources. This is a CDC was trying to get resources from an agency in City Hall. The person that he needed those resources from, specifically, they were in the same graduating class. Couldn't get him to return a phone call, right? So like, while it can be a significant barrier to entry and understanding things, totally true. The caveat though, is that like maybe a necessary but insufficient to really sort of making moves once you're already in the field.
The book questions a lot about what actually constitutes community. We talked about this, but what surprised you the most about how different groups and organizations define the term community?
The thing that probably surprised me the most, and this is getting a little meta, but is how everyone could define it differently, implicitly when they're speaking, but not like be confusing to one another. And the reason why that was surprising is because, you think of language, and you particularly think of this language in community development. A lot of this work is technical. We're using acronyms, right? We're talking about projects that have very technical specifications. We're talking about like acronyms that relate to, how tall a building can be, all these kinds of things, FAR, all this kind of stuff. But when it came to community, people like were saying it and talking about it, but meaning different things when they're saying it, and like not making it explicit when they were talking to each other. And it became less surprising when I sat down and thought about it more and understood that we're not really talking about a specific community here. We're not talking about Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. We're not talking about the people who show up to a meeting. We're not talking about a racial or ethnic group that we think should be empowered and part of the process. We're not talking about any of that. And we're also talking about all of that at the same time. And to make sense of all of that, I had to think about what this concept means and how it gets used. And I think in that regard, the different definitions weren't so surprising as it was that like all of it was about something good. When it was used, it was to elevate one's position. If I say I'm representing the community, I'm saying that in order for you to respect me more, for you to take what I'm going to say more seriously. If I say I went out to the community and did community organizing, it's the same thing. I'm sort of marshaling some moral worth and value from what I'm saying. And then by talking about it, I'm performing it. If I'm bring people out to a particular meeting, I'm sort of exemplifying that I am truly attuned to what the community wants. And so to me, the sort of then surprising thing about all of this was like how it all made sense when everyone was talking about different things. And ultimately, the big sort of conclusion of the book, reflected again in that sort of play on words in the title, is how we're using the concept not so much to have a particular denotation or to denote a particular group or place or person, but to use it in small p political negotiations, to pursue political ends, to elevate my position, to say the thing that I want to see on this vacant lot is the right thing, the appropriate thing, the legitimate thing. And community is a very valuable tool in making that work. The upside of that then is that those that are sort of at the grassroots can use it effectively to elevate their position. But also because this concept and because this word can mean a lot of different things, and we never really define it when we're engaging in these debates, say at a community meeting, it also meant that public officials could do this sort of 1-2 step, or maybe, what you might call in slang terms like an okey doke, a sort of sleight of hand, where they can talk a game of community, they can talk about valuing the community, but never really be able to be held accountable to specific people, specific neighborhoods, specific processes, right? Because we all say, yeah, the community is good. So if someone says, I don't think this project is reflective of the community, a city official that's hosting that meeting, the community being say, all right, well, that's why we're having the community meeting. We have a community process. We'll have more community meetings. We'll organize the community. We'll go out to the community. We'll bring the community to the meeting, and so on and so forth, right? Meaning all these different things, meaning the place, meaning the people that participate, and so on. And like, what do you say to that? How do you say no? You say, yeah, well, someone in the audience, and this happened routinely, people in the audience would say, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, we value the community. Community process is good. We should have more community. And it sort of allows those that are sort of pushing things forward to not necessarily be pushed to be transparent about specifically who's going to benefit, which neighborhood are we talking about, who's going to be there. And so I think then the surprising thing isn't so much that like there's a lot of different, definitions that are in play. That shouldn't surprise any of us, right? We all use the concept so much. The surprising thing was more how important and powerful it was for sort of tying all this together, for being the main currency in which we debate and decide what happens in poor neighborhoods. And I think making that more explicit, making that taken for granted aspect of community and sort of deconstructing it, if you will, I think was really important to sort of reveal this sort of fundamental underlying truth of what is going on.
So in the end of the book, you have solutions and some ideas that you have to make some of these things better. One of them is related to public outreach or community organizing or whatever that might be. How does that get kind of deconstructed and reconstructed in the way that you were just speaking about community and how it's represented? Because, and there's a quote in the book that I think was really my aha moment. I'll just say right now, there will never be a definitive answer to the question of true, authentic community representation because there's no such thing as a single cohesive community voice.
Exactly. So that sentence, that line, flies in the face of how the entire community meeting process and apparatus is set up, right? The whole process works best and is designed to assume that the process, if done right, if we have the right urban planning exercises, if we do a fun map game on the table where we put different things in different places that urban planners love, if we do some dot thing on a map on like a big poster board or whatever, that then we'll be able to come together, we'll talk it out, we'll break up into groups, come back to the big group, and we'll have the community's vision of what the community wants. It assumes and works best when there is a singular community voice. Now, of course, if you push someone that does this to say, well, is there going to be a singular community voice? They'll say, well, no, there's lots of community. People want different things. There's many different things. Okay, but then why are we doing this in the first place? If the modal answer, if the most common experience of after a community meeting or community process is, well, a lot of people want a lot of different things, then why are we doing this in the first place and calling it a community meeting, right? Like, it kind of doesn't make any sense when you think about it that way. And I think that like that assumption that sort of undergirds the whole process is faulty. And in that regard, I think that the solution is not going to be about getting the right people or more representative people to the meeting, which is what I think a fair and reasonable reaction when we say like, oh, it's mostly white people or homeowners that are disproportionately coming to these meetings, those that have the time and energy and effort to be able to show up in the evening without childcare and so on. All true, all valid, all important. But I think that doesn't change the underlying assumption that if you had more representative sort of groups, that then it still assumes you're going to have a singular voice, right? It doesn't work if at the end of every meeting, a lot of people thought different things. It sort of all falls apart. And so one of the things that I'm, thinking about in the book, and in fact, since it's come out, I've become almost a little bit more aggressive about it, is to frankly abolish community meetings, at least as we know them. I think that process and community meeting of getting people together at a set time and place can be really good and beneficial. So maybe get people's feelings, people's reactions, people's struggles, like like a focus group almost, right? What are people hurting? Where are they hurting? In the jargon terms of like consultants, what are the pain points or whatever? I think in terms of like getting a sense of like, what do people want to see and having them sort of hash that out, community meetings are terrible. They're horrible for figuring that out, right? Like there's no way to make them better. No better representation is going to change that, I think, fundamental flaw. And so what I propose in the book, what I still sort of think is a better path forward, is what if we just sort of abandon this whole assumption that there's going to be a singular community voice? What if we assume instead that there will be contention? What if we assume instead there will be conflict? What if we assume instead that almost every project is going to have a Black middle class homeowners on Woodhaven Street that don't want a station and others that might want it, and that's okay, and that's going to be the case? And what if we also assume that a single meeting or even multiple meetings restricted in time and place is not going to be the best venue for getting a lot of different ideas on the table that may be conflicting? What if we get rid of all of that and then focus then on, okay, what would we do to get the most ideas on the table and be transparent about what those ideas are and think some way to sort of display them? And so there's two examples that I had in the book. One that's straight tech driven, that's something called a Pairwise Wiki Survey, which essentially is almost like an online game where you are prompted with a question and you have a forced choice of two different possible answers. You got to pick one or the other. There's some nuance there. You can say, well, I can't decide, or I like both, or I don't like both, or whatever. And then there's an algorithm that on the back end will rank them, create sort of a system of sort of ranking. And that system works best when more people participate more. So it can totally account for the stronger voices in the room that a public community meeting cannot. It totally can control for a more sort of persuasive orator, like someone's vocal, like being, more persuasive as a debater, because that gets washed away. Again, the algorithm is smarter, more people play it. And I think another option that's similar to that is like something that Design Studio for Social Intervention did, which was a art installation that had essentially a big board on a place where there was like, what would you like to see on this space? And you could vote on different things. And I think the great thing about that overcomes a lot of these problems with the public community meeting process and does, I think, things a lot better, is that it is much better at getting more ideas on the table than any public community can, because the whole point is to get more ideas. It's a failure if there aren't more conflicting ideas, right? Whereas community meetings are the exact opposite. If people are screaming at each other, if people have differences of opinion, then the meeting goes off the rails. It's a disaster. This totally is different than that. It also then assumes there is no one singular community voice, right? There's a lot of different people in a particular neighborhood or place that may have different opinions. I also think it's important to recognize that maybe people from outside a particular neighborhood may also have good ideas that can be thrown out there and people can sort of make sense of them and think about them as well. And I think it doesn't have to sort of be limited. You can have it be in a particular place. The time can be, it's totally, open, especially something that's online. And it also, I think most importantly, though, doesn't allow particularly government officials, those that are often the sort of endpoint in deciding what's going to happen, to sort of justify their decisions by saying, well, we heard from the community and this is where the community seemed to want to go. When they say that, there's no way to really check them and say, well, actually, we did a vote and all these people, said something different. Even if there was a vote at a community meeting, they can say, well, we did community organizing and like people in the community said something else. Like there's no way to verify that or to discount that. And these other processes, quite literally, they're showing visibly to all of our faces where the different priorities are. And even if someone that's making the ultimate decision says, well, the most votes in this poor neighborhood were for luxury housing because a bunch of people from outside the neighborhood maybe came in and voted, who knows, right? They can say, well, we don't think that's right and we want to do something else. But it forces them to be transparent about it. What we have now in the community meeting process both fails in regard to not having broad participation. It fails in regard to making an assumption that's untenable, that there's going to be a singular community vision. And it also fails in regard to not really holding public officials accountable as you might think a public community could. I think these alternatives, they don't deal with everything. They don't sort of necessarily have the right people that we might think that maybe are marginalized from these processes that we think should have an even bigger say. They don't really account for that. And I think that's there's room to grow in that regard. But I think they accomplish things that the public community process doesn't. And they also avoid a lot of the really, I think, foundational pitfalls that will remain no matter who shows up on a given Tuesday night at 6:00.
Yeah, I think that's just so fascinating. It just reminds me of all these times, especially in San Francisco, where, a community process was finished. Even in Philadelphia recently, there was a thing where a community process was finished. It was 10 years in. Yep. And then somebody comes in on the back end and says, well, my voice wasn't heard.
Exactly.
Then you go through another 10-year process and it's like, is this ever going to end? Are we ever going to do something? No.
And it won't. And it's undeniable when they come back like that and say, and it's the community wasn't fully heard. You can't say, well, no, it actually was, right? They become uncontestable claims. And this is sort of the problem. And it ends up sort of favoring the status quo. I mean, the other problem here too is that when the orientation is towards having the community's vision come out through these processes, it's going to then either implicitly or explicitly rely on community consensus, right? We want the community, right? If we have a community vision, there should be consensus around this. And in fact, a lot of urban planning exercises are oriented around getting consensus. Participatory democracy processes want to help get us towards some consensus. At the meetings, people say, well, we want to leave here with some consensus. Well, when our goal is consensus, that doesn't empower everyone equally. It actually empowers those that want to come in 10 years later and say no. They are empowered significantly more than everyone else that's ever been a part of the process and wants to say yes. And I think this is where actually some of the findings do relate, even though the book isn't explicit about the YIMBY-NIMBY world, it does relate actually to a lot of those debates, because the way that public meeting structures are set up, those that want to say no, to revert to the status quo, to not do something, are fundamentally more powerful than those that say yes. Why? Because if 3 people show up to a meeting of 50 people, or whatever the numbers might be, and say, we are members of the community and we don't think this should happen, by definition, you no longer have community consensus. It becomes a liability. It could become a liability to move the project forward. Those that want to say yes overwhelmingly could be more than those that want to say no, but they need everyone to say yes to establish unanimity and consensus, right? Or they need the political will of those that are making the decisions to say, you know what, those people that are saying no are a small group or whatever. We disagree with them and we think we should, move forward. So the whole public meeting process, to me, and one of the big problems there is that it favors the no's, period. End of sentence, right? Like it's structurally set up because if our goal is consensus, again, like establishing lack of consensus is significantly easier arithmetically, mathematically, than establishing consensus even from a collective action political problem, right? And I think that we've set up a system that implicitly, like it's taken for granted. We're not really thinking about this, but I think that system sets that up. So to me, the vision moving forward is, how do we not have less participation? How do we have actually more participation, but that avoids some of those, what I see as structural challenges that are baked into the cake of the way that we do the community process and community meetings today?
Well, this book is a must read, I think, for folks. I definitely got a ton out of it. It's one of these books I feel like I need to send to a bunch of people to read.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Constructing Community, Urban Governance, Development, and Inequality in Boston. Where can folks find it if they want to get a copy of the book?
You can get it directly from Princeton Press. You can get it from any other sort of major book retailers. You can also get it from independent booksellers from indiebound.org is, I believe, the correct address. But that one will identify local independent bookstores in your particular area based on your zip code. And it's a great source in general for getting books, but the book can be found there as well.
Awesome. And we always recommend bookshop.org. We're also an affiliate of Bookshop. So
Perfect.
If folks want to get the book from there, they can do that as well. Well, there's so much more in here that we could have chatted about, but I want people to go and read the book. And there's a million more ideas and things in there that are amazing. And hopefully folks get a chance to check it out. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.